This was one of the videos recorded for one of the meetings at Christi at UTSA. Aside from a few minor edits to clean up the long pauses, it's virtually the exact same video, but in any case, here's the video. Hope y'all enjoy.
All right, I guess we can get started. So welcome everyone. This is the last meeting for Ratio Christi, but it's a joint meeting with the Philosophy Club. So my gratitude goes towards the Philosophy Club for co-hosting this meeting. Today we have a guest speaker, Dr. Joshua Sijuwade. Dr. Sijuwade is a philosopher whose work focuses on metaphysics, philosophy of religion, and analytic theology, with particular expertise in the doctrine of the Trinity and the nature of God. He has published in leading academic journals and contributed to ongoing conversations at the intersection of philosophy and Christian theology. Through his work, he brings rigorous analytical tools to some of the most profound questions about divine nature and reality. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshua Sijuwade.
So good evening everyone from my end. I'm in the UK, so it's evening for me. It might be afternoon for you guys, and I hope you're all doing well. So thank you for inviting me to discuss what many philosophers consider is the most formidable challenge to theistic belief, which is the problem of evil. Now, today I want to present a novel approach, what I term the exemplarist theodicy, that fundamentally reframes our understanding of how an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good God could permit the suffering we observe in our world. And I want to emphasize from the outset that this is not merely an academic exercise, but rather addresses a problem with profound existential significance, one that shapes how we understand human suffering, how we respond to tragedy, and whether we can maintain rational belief in a good God in the face of overwhelming evidence from suffering. Now, to understand the depth of this challenge, we must begin where philosophy itself began with this question. For Epicurus, over 2 millennia ago, he framed the dilemma with piercing clarity when he asked, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? This ancient question has echoed through the centuries, gaining urgency with each new tragedy, from the Lisbon earthquake to the Holocaust, from the tsunami disaster of 2004 to ongoing suffering from cancer and malaria, such that when we confront concrete realities, like William Rowe's famous example of a fawn dying slowly in a forest fire, or a child enduring lingering agony from terminal cancer, we recognize that these are not abstract philosophical puzzles, but lived experiences that make many thoughtful individuals conclude, as J.L. Mackie did, that the problem of evil is the rock on which theism founders. Now, building upon this classical formulation, contemporary philosophy has refined this challenge into two distinct formulations, with the logical problem claiming that God's existence is incompatible with evil, generating a logical contradiction, whilst the evidential problem makes a more devastating claim, and the particular evils we observe provide strong evidence against God's existence. For as Paul Draper argues, the patterns of pain and pleasure in our world look much more like what we would expect from a universe indifferent to sentient welfare than from one governed by a perfectly loving God. Now, before presenting my solution, we must understand why traditional theodicies, where theodicies are justification for why God allows evil, leave crucial questions unanswered. As beginning with the free will defense of Alvin Plantinga, which argues that evil is a necessary consequence of granting genuine freedom, it successfully refutes the logical problem for moral evil, yet it struggles with natural evil, like earthquakes, fails to show that free will's value outweighs horrendous suffering, like the Holocaust, and faces questions about why God could not create free beings with better moral character. Similarly, the soul-making theodicy of John Hick suggests that suffering creates conditions for moral growth, with the world functioning as a veil of soul-making, where creatures develop virtues in response to adversity. Yet this theodicy faces the problem of distribution, asking why suffering is so unevenly distributed, and moreover, Suffering often destroys rather than builds character, for we see people crushed by trauma rather than ennobled by it. Finally, skeptical theism emphasizes human cognitive limitations, arguing that given the cognitive distance between finite humans and an infinite God, we should not expect to understand all reasons for permitting suffering. Yet whilst this approach has merit, it risks undermining the moral intuitions that ground our concept of divine goodness. For if we cannot trust our judgment that certain evils appear unjustified, how can we trust our judgment that God is good? And furthermore, at the end of the day, provides no positive explanation for suffering. Each traditional approach then offers partial insights, but fails to provide a comprehensive framework that addresses both the philosophical rigor required and the moral sensitivity demanded by the gravity of suffering. So we need something more robust. Now, the theodicy I propose begins with a fundamental insight from contemporary moral philosophy. Morality itself is grounded in exemplars, individuals whose admirable qualities we recognize through reflective admiration. So these exemplars do not merely follow moral rules, they embody and create moral reality through their character, serving as living demonstrations of goodness. They ground morality itself, providing the very standards by which we understand what is good, just, courageous, or compassionate. Moreover, exemplars spread goodness throughout the world through their actions and influence, transforming not only themselves, but their communities and ultimately all of creation. This is what I call creative flourishing, the highest form of participation in divine creativity, where creatures become active co-creators of goodness rather than passive recipients of it. Now, with this background in mind, the Exemplarist Theodicy, put simply in an elevator pitch form, states that God allows suffering for two reasons. Either, one, to enable individuals, human or animal, to transform into exemplars, or two, to provide others, divine, human or animal, with the opportunities to do so. So this is the core statement of the Theodicy that unifies the entire framework and explains both why suffering exists and how it serves a divine purpose despite its intrinsic badness. But how exactly does this transformation that is at the heart of the central tenets of this Theodicy occur? And where precisely does suffering become necessary? The answer lies in understanding that exemplar transformation develops through a structured progression. This transformation unfolds across four distinct conceptual stages, and at each stage, suffering plays an indispensable role, not as an unfortunate side effect, but as a logically necessary condition. Without suffering at each of these conceptual stages, this transformation into exemplars would be literally impossible, even for an omnipotent God. So now let me walk you through each of these stages and demonstrate how suffering functions as an essential element in the process. So stage one, participation in the basic goods. The transformation into an exemplar begins with participation in 7 fundamental goods that have been systematized in the work of John Finnis, and which are that of life, knowledge, play, aesthetic experience, sociability, practical reasonableness, and religion. And here suffering becomes logically necessary because for any good to be recognized as such, there must be contrast. That is, the possibility of its absence, which follows from the very logic of how values are perceived and pursued. We see this principle operative through some concrete examples. For the basic good of life itself is most vividly appreciated by those who have faced mortality, such as cancer survivors who speak of newfound gratitude for each day, whilst the good of knowledge becomes clear through struggling with ignorance, as a scientist laboring through failed experiments understands knowledge's value in ways that the potentially certain never can. And when we turn to sociability, we find that loneliness illuminates the profound value of authentic connection, such that those who have experienced isolation develop appreciation for friendship that those who never lacked it rarely achieve, whilst practical reasonableness becomes clear through suffering that follows poor choices. Suffering thus provides essential contrast for recognizing the basic goods, but it also provides feedback, indicating the gap between our current state and our potential. For physical pain signals damage and prompts behavioral change, and suffering functions analogously across all basic goods. As dissatisfaction with ignorance motivates learning, loneliness drives us towards community, guilt prompts reformation, and emptiness spurs the search for purpose, such that without these painful signals, we would remain blind to what is missing. Stage 2, exercise of self-formation. Moving from the recognition of the basic goods to active character development, the second stage involves the capacity to shape one's character through deliberate choices that I call, drawing from the work of Robert Kane, self-forming actions. Self-forming actions are moments where competing motivations create opportunities for profound character development, such as a whistleblower who faces a dilemma of exposing wrongdoing and facing severe consequences, or remaining silent and preserving their career, where the internal tension between integrity and self-preservation is itself a form of suffering essential to the formative power of the choice. We can also think of a person caring for a patient with dementia, where day after day they face a choice between patient care, which drains them emotionally, and resentment, which eases their burden but violates their values, such that each moment of choosing patience involves real internal conflict that shapes who they are becoming. The crucial insight is that without this internal tension, without this suffering, choices will lack the friction necessary for truly formative struggle. For a decision involving no competing efforts, no resistance, no cost cannot be genuinely self-forming, but is merely following the path of least resistance. And when someone chooses integrity despite personal cost, they actively create themselves as persons of integrity, where their suffering involved is not incidental, but constitutive of self-creation. Stage 3, acquisition of virtues. Having established how suffering enables both the recognition of goods and self-formation, we reach the conceptual stage, stage 3, where exemplarity requires developing specific virtues like courage, compassion, wisdom, justice, patience, perseverance, and temperance. And here is a logical necessity that cuts to the heart of the matter. These virtues are defined by their relationship to adversity and cannot exist, not merely cannot easily exist, but logically cannot exist without the hardships they address. To see this clearly, consider courage. For as Aristotle defined it, this is the virtue concerned with fear and confidence in the face of death or serious harm. But courage is conceptually impossible without danger to overcome. For you cannot be courageous in the absence of anything to fear, such that if we remove all danger, courage becomes literally impossible. This same logical structure applies to compassion, which is the virtue of being moved by others' suffering to help alleviate it. But compassion logically requires suffering to witness and address. As Martha Nussbaum describes, compassion involves recognizing that a person is suffering seriously. Yet without suffering in the world, compassion would be conceptually impossible. Similarly, patience requires frustration to endure. Justice involves responding to injustice. Perseverance requires obstacles to overcome. Temperance involves moderating desires that might lead astray. And wisdom develops through making mistakes and suffering their consequences. For Aristotle emphasized that wisdom requires extensive life experience, particularly experience of hardship, such that these are not innate dispositions, but acquired excellences emerging through engagement with hardship. As Aristotle was clear, we become just by doing just acts, brave by doing brave acts, and these acts require the circumstances that call them forth. whilst the degree of virtue often correlates with the severity of adversity overcome. For we recognize greater courage in facing greater dangers and deeper compassion in responding to more profound suffering. Stage 4, transformative experiences. Having traced how suffering enables recognition of the basic goods, self-formation, and virtue acquisition, we reach the final conceptual stage, which involves what philosophers like L.A. Paul called transformative experiences, which are profound encounters that fundamentally alter our values, preferences, and character, being both epistemically transformative, that is, providing otherwise inaccessible knowledge, and personally transformative, that is, changing who we are at a fundamental level. In human life, such transformative experiences often emerge through suffering, as a person who lives through a life-threatening illness may come to see time and relationships in a radically new way. Someone who loses a loved one may discover depths of compassion unavailable beforehand. Whilst a parent caring for a disabled child can find that their whole identity is reshaped around patience and commitment to others. And in each case, suffering provides the intensity and attention-focusing power necessary for transformation. So through these 4 conceptual stages, the transformation unfolds in its completeness. Suffering enables individuals to recognize and pursue the fundamental basic goods, to make difficult but formative self-forming choices, to develop virtues that constitute moral excellence, and finally to undergo experiences that reshape their character, where the result is not simply a better person, but an exemplar whose stable goodness provides a reference point for others and whose actions contributes to the moral quality of the world. So now we'll focus on extending this to animal suffering. So one might be persuaded concerning human suffering, but what of animal suffering? As this is where many theodicies falter most dramatically. For Rowe's famous example focuses precisely on a fawn dying in a forest fire, and the sheer scale of animal suffering is staggering when we consider billions of animals in factory farms and wild animals dying from predation, starvation, and disease, such that Darwin himself was haunted by this as a profound challenge to belief in a beneficent creator. As I've just said, traditional theodicies struggle here, for the free will defense cannot explain animal suffering, whilst soul-making approaches seem anthropocentric, appearing to instrumentalize animals, and many find animal suffering even more troubling because animals cannot understand why they suffer or find meaning in it. However, the Exemplarist Theodicy extends naturally to non-human creatures because recent research in cognitive ethology, that is, the study of animal minds, comparative psychology, animal ethics, and animal behavior, reveals that many animals possess far more sophisticated cognitive and emotional capacities than previously recognized. And animals can be what Mark Rowlands has called moral subjects, that is, entities that are motivated by moral emotions. And thus animals can themselves undergo the exemplar transformation process. So to understand how the Exemplarist Theodicy applies to animals, we must examine what contemporary science reveals. For primatologists like Franz de Waal have documented complex moral behaviors in great apes, including fairness concerns, empathy, and consolation behavior. Whilst elephants display profound grief, corvids show remarkable problem solving and future planning. Cetaceans have complex social structures and demonstrate helping behaviors, and dogs display loyalty and an emotional attunement beyond simple conditioning. Even animals we consider simple show unexpected sophistication. As octopuses solve complex problems and show distinct personalities, rats display empathy by helping trapped cage mates, even when it costs them food. And fish show more complex cognition than previously recognized, such that the picture emerging from contemporary ethology is of a natural world far richer in consciousness and morality than traditional philosophy assumed. This research reveals that many animals can experience pleasure and pain with subjective awareness, form social bonds, and suffer from their disruption. learn from experience, display primitive forms of fairness, show empathetic responses to others' distress, engage in cooperative behaviors, make choices between competing motivations, and undergo behavioral changes from novel experiences. And these capacities matter tremendously because they suggest animals can participate in species appropriate ways in the same four-stage transformative process. So, beginning with stage one, animals participate in species appropriate versions of the basic goods. As the good of life is pursued through foraging and avoiding predators, knowledge manifests in learning about the environment. Play is ubiquitous among mammals, and sociability is fundamental for social species like wolf packs and elephant families. And here again, so as in the human context, suffering provides contrast for recognizing these goods. Young wolves, for instance, learn through play fighting involving minor pain. They learn hunting through failed attempts that leave them hungry, and they learn cooperation through conflicts requiring resolution. Such that the contrast between hunger and satiation, between isolation and pack belonging, enables wolves to recognize and pursue goods effectively. Moving to stage two, cognitively advanced animals like great apes, elephants, cetaceans, and corvids evidence some form of primitive self-forming actions. As when a chimpanzee faces the choice between immediate gratification and waiting for a larger reward, competing motivations create internal tension. Whilst Jane Goodall documented chimpanzees showing moral conflict, torn between self-interest and group norms, and a mother bear protecting cubs faces real competing motivations, where self-preservation wars against protective instincts, such that a resolution represents genuine character formation. For stage three, research on animal morality, what Mark Burkhoff and Jessica Pierce call wild justice, reveals animals developing species-relative virtuous traits through adversity in three cluster sets: cooperation, empathy, and justice. Within the cooperation cluster, wolves hunting large prey must coordinate actions, suppress individual impulses, and fairly distribute kills, developing through the adversity of difficult hunts. Whilst the empathy cluster appears throughout the animal kingdom, as elephants comfort distressed herd members, dolphins support injured companions, and primates show consolation behavior after conflicts. For an elephant who has never seen another in distress cannot develop compassionate responsiveness. And within the justice cluster, fairness concerns are documented widely in primates and canines. Capuchins, for example, capuchin monkeys, refuse unfair distributions, showing anger when a companion receives better rewards. And these proto-justice sensibilities develop through experiencing inequality. Finally, for stage four, animals undergo transformative experiences that fundamentally alter their behavior. As a young predator's first successful hunt is both epistemically transformative, providing knowledge only obtainable through doing it, and personally transformative, changing self-conception from dependent juvenile to capable hunter. Whilst a mother's first experience of caring for offspring transforms priorities fundamentally, and a wolf experiencing its first winter as an alpha faces responsibility for pack survival through harsh conditions. And these experiences fundamentally transform the individual, where the wolf emerges with deeper understanding of leadership and altered priorities, requiring the intensity of real suffering with real state. The Exemplarist Theodicy thus provides a comprehensive framework for animal suffering that respects animal cognition, extends the four-stage process to animals in species-appropriate ways, avoids anthropocentrism by giving animals' own transformation genuine importance, and maintains logical necessity even for animal suffering, thus ultimately transforming the problem of animal suffering from the Theodicy's most intractable challenge into a powerful confirmation of the Theodicy's explanatory scope. So now, having established how suffering enables exemplar transformation in both humans and animals, we must address an important challenge: namely that of the fact that not all who suffer can undergo the transformative process. For we must consider young children who lack cognitive development, severely cognitively impaired adults, animals with limited cognition, and those who die before transformation. However, the second part of the definition that I provided earlier for the Exemplarist Theodicy allows suffering either to enable individuals to transform into exemplars, or the second one, to provide others, divine, human, or animal, with the opportunities to do so. And in the cases of what I call non-exemplary sufferers, those who cannot transform, the first option is not available. And so the focus now shifts to the second. That is, even the suffering of non-exemplary sufferers provides essential opportunities for others to undergo exemplar transformation. As the parent caring for a severely disabled child faces opportunities for developing profound patience, unconditional love, and perseverance, the medical professional treating terminal childhood cancers develops compassion and courage, and the activist fighting for rights of the cognitively disabled develops exemplarity precisely through responding to their suffering. But there is a second, more profound response that requires introducing a crucial theological concept: divine omni-subjectivity, which was introduced by Linda Zagzebski and is understood as God's ability to perfectly experience the first-person perspective of every conscious being. So in following Zagzebski's work, omni-subjectivity means that God does not merely know about creaturely experiences from an external third-person perspective. Rather, God experiences everything we experience by living our life, grasping it from our first-person perspective in a perfectly empathetic way. God feels total empathy towards every individual, sharing in their complete conscious experience as if it was happening to him, whilst maintaining his own divine identity. So let me emphasize what this means. Every pain felt by any creature is felt by God. For the child dying slowly from cancer, God experiences that suffering as the child experiences it. Whilst the fawn burning in the forest fire means God feels that terror and agony from within. And the severely disabled adult in frustration and confusion means God shares that mental anguish, such that every tear, every cry, every moment of suffering across all creation is experienced by God with full divine sensitivity. And now, here is where the theodicy reveals its most startling implication. Through omni-subjectivity, God himself undergoes transformation into an exemplar, the supreme exemplar, by experiencing all creature suffering. That is, consider the virtues we most admire: courage, compassion, patience, resilience, the wisdom born of hardship. For these virtues are intrinsically tied to limitation, vulnerability, and suffering. Yet God, being maximally powerful and perfect, seems incapable of manifesting them directly, which raises the question: how can an omnipotent being show courage, which requires facing genuine danger? How can an eternal being display patience, which requires enduring delays and frustrations? How can an invulnerable being demonstrate resilience, which requires overcoming adversity? The answer is through omni-subjectivity. God experiences all these limitations from within through perfect empathy with suffering creatures. God encounters danger, need, delay, and adversity as they encounter it. And this allows God to manifest these virtues, not despite his omnipotence, but through his perfect participation in creaturely experience. When God experiences the fear of the persecuted activist through omni-subjectivity, God manifests courage by facing that fear from within. When God experiences the pain of the suffering child, God manifests compassion by sharing in that suffering completely. When God experiences the frustration of the person with dementia, God manifests patience by enduring that confusion empathetically. And when God experiences the trauma of the disaster victim, God manifests resilience by participating in that recovery. Every instance of creaturely suffering provides God with the opportunity to manifest virtues that otherwise would be impossible for an omnipotent being. Through experiencing all suffering across all creatures, God becomes the supreme exemplar, the ultimate standard of every virtue, including those tied to limitation. In this way, God does not simply display these virtues, but serves both as their ontological and epistemic ground. Ontologically, because the fullest and most unified reality of courage, compassion, patience, and resilience is found in the way they're perfectly lived in the divine life that embraces every creature's suffering. And epistemically, because our clearest and most reliable grasp of what these virtues are is gained by referring back to God's response to suffering as a decisive standard for understanding them. God thus is able to transform through others' experiences of suffering into the supreme exemplar of all morality. The theodicy thus reveals God not as a distant orchestrator of suffering, but as a participant in all suffering, bearing every creature's pain within the divine experience, while working towards the highest possible good, comprehensive exemplar transformation that includes God's own transformation into the supreme exemplar. So this supreme exemplar grounds morality across all cultures and generations, provides the ultimate standard for all virtues, including those tied to limitation, and ensures that every instance of suffering, no matter how isolated, how brief, how apparently pointless, contributes to the highest possible good. So in conclusion, what this theodicy offers is a comprehensive framework for understanding how evil can coexist with divine goodness, not through appeal to mystery or cognitive limitations, but through positive explanation of suffering's logical necessity for the highest possible good, the transformation of creatures into exemplars who ground morality and spread goodness throughout the world. A world without suffering will be a world without courage, compassion, perseverance, wisdom, justice, or the capacity for profound self-formation. It will be a world of perpetual childhood, never maturing into the moral excellence that exemplarity represents, such that God's love consists not in preventing all pain, but in creating conditions for exemplarity. The theodicy reveals a God who does not observe suffering from a distance, but participates in it through divine omni-subjectivity, bearing all creaturely pain as God's own, not as a distant observer, but as one who shares in the suffering itself, such that this is not a God indifferent to pain, but maximally invested in it, experiencing all of it whilst working towards purpose that give it profound meaning. And through this participation in creaturely suffering, God himself becomes the supreme exemplar, the ultimate standard of all virtue, and the foundation of morality across all creation. The Exemplarist Theodicy thus provides a framework worthy of the challenge, one that respects both the philosophical sophistication required and the moral seriousness demanded, showing how an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God could permit the suffering we observe through profound commitment to the highest possible good. A world of exemplars who ground morality and spread goodness, who become, as C.S. Lewis called them, little Christs, bearers of divine goodness, who transform the world through their very being. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Amazing. That was really good.
Gotcha. Sweet. We'll proceed to the Q&A portion of this discussion. Instead of me going around and like handing this mic over to people, I'm just gonna leave this mic over here, and whoever wants questions can just get them. You're up first.
I absolutely love to. First off, awesome. I really love extending theodicies to, particularly yours, to non-human animals as well. The part I'm really interested in is you claimed that there would be species-specific responsibilities, such as like they would be different from like humans and octopuses and such. I already see this. Yeah, you know where this is going. Where like, would there not be a general morality for all animals, and then that general morality would only be conditioned by the individuals on a case-by-case basis, depending on their agency in that moment?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for the kind comments. So I would say, so just to, not to plug the book, but there's a book coming out within the next 2 months that goes through this. It's been published by Routledge, called The Exemplarist Theodicy. And you can find it in all good bookstores. But yeah, so In that, I sort of laid, I didn't obviously have the opportunity to do here, but I lay the sort of metaphysical and ethical foundation for the theodicy. And within the metaphysical foundation is the affirmation of something called robust realism, which is the idea that of moral realism, that there are stance independent moral truths, moral properties, whatever elements of morality you want to look to, it stands independent. And this will also be for the animal sort of realm, that there are moral truths about generally that applies to all across all animal species, and they are independent of God, independent of everything. However, when they are actualized within that specific species, they will take a specific relativistic form. So the way in which, let's say, an octopus or let's say a corvid, a way a corvid might show courage might be different to a way that an elephant might show courage or bravery or that type of thing. So the way in which there's a general sort of idea that there'll be courage that's instantiated by a corvid and instantiated by an elephant or by a wolf, but the ways in which they will be expressed will be appropriate to their specific cognitive abilities and also the natures in which they have. So there is sort of a general moral structure that stands independent, but the way that they're actualized will be relative to that specific species. Yeah.
Thanks. So I read over part of your essay, Dr. Sijuwade, and I wanted to have you explicate something on a good state of affairs and a state of affairs being a greater good. There was an example that I had in mind, but sorry for the noise, 1 second. There's an example I had in mind, but I want to make sure that I have a grasp on it first. You listed out two of them, the two bases. Where was it? It was like literally right there. Yeah. So the first requirement, allowing an individual to suffer, is the only morally permissible way in which God can make possible the occurrence of the good state of affairs. The expected value of allowing the experience of suffering, giving the good state of affairs, is positive. I was talking with earlier, like an hour ago, about some of this, and I made mention that we would consider as well part of the expected value of that transition in state of affairs to a greater good would include the transformations themselves, right?
Yes. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So my concern here is one of a limited amount of transformation, and I want to draw it up on the board real quick.
Yeah.
The idea that I had is let's index some state of affairs here, state 0. Let's say that the situation, we've got an island of people, and they participate in society, but just kind of on a necessary level. They're all pretty selfish. But now, every year, a horrible typhoon, hurricane is going to come through. And so once it comes through, we've got some suffering, obviously, as a hurricane will give you. And one of the people on the island decides to do a truly selfless act. They're courageous. They rescue someone from out from under a flood or something like that. They pull someone out of a building before it's destroyed. And so right now, there's been a transformation. And so the next year, now we have an exemplar. All the people are like, "Hi, that right there that's a hero. That's someone who has helped us. That's someone who's done something virtuous," which is kind of a new thing for them. No one was really virtuous before these things started happening. And so next year, we have more suffering from the same new annual hurricane. And this continues on and on, S3. The same suffering exists in all these states of affairs. But in each state of affairs, in each transition between these states, we see more and more virtue emerge. We see transformations come about. We see people value their relationships. We see them enjoy life more when they have it. Here's the issue I see. Eventually, we're going to reach a state, hypothetically, where almost all of the transformation that could occur, almost all of the virtue that the people could be brought about in terms of character, all of that's been acquired. And so anytime we make a jump, because it's not like the hurricane is just going to stop coming. So every year we have a hurricane where the same amount of suffering occurs, but we no longer see these transformations. And God included continues to experience these things. He experienced subjectively through these people, or vicariously through these people, the transformations of courage, generosity, selflessness. But now it's an exercise constantly of the virtues themselves. No one else is really transforming into exemplars. And so we have sort of this effect of diminishing returns, and it doesn't seem like as things go on, there can be a greater good past a certain point. You mentioned that, or you said very specifically that suffering here is logically necessary. It needs to exist. But that means that as your state of affairs continue, even as this society continues down into this utopic state, as perfect as it can be, you have the same amount of suffering. And so your expected value, it may start out high, moving between states of affairs, but eventually it's going to hit zero. And once you hit a certain ratio, it's going to go negative. No matter what you do, no matter how much virtue is practiced, no matter how much courage is used to save people, people are going to die, people are going to lose their homes, people are going to suffer from the sicknesses caused by the destructions of hospitals. As we go along, no matter the transformation, we are going to see the same suffering, and we are going to see a drop in expected value. And so in the ideal situation where transformation occurs constantly, all the way to the end, we will end up with low or negative expected value from these transformations, from this suffering.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much for that. That's a really good point and a strong point as well. So I really appreciate that. I've got two main responses to this. The first one would be, and again, this is not, when you were saying, sorry, just for clarification, were you saying you read my essay? Was that my published work on it, or just the general outline?
I think it might have been the general outline. It was the 50-page one from Phil Papers.
Oh, okay, yeah. So that's my. So I had an article on that. So that's when I first introduced it. But there's been a lot of nuances and further developments. That's why again I'm plugging this book, because it sort of goes into more detail. But so I do address this issue, because even though it sounds like transformation is a sort of off and on thing, so that once you display the courage. Unless you display it over an extent of time, you then become courageous, and that's it. You've been transformed. That's not the way that I see this to be the case. I see the transformation is also including the maintenance of the virtue. So, for example, let's say someone is a gym goer and they lift weights and they get quite bulky and they get quite muscular. They could just say, "Oh well, I've become muscular now. That's it. I don't need to exercise anymore and feel the suffering or the going through the suffering experience of lifting weights." But then obviously that wouldn't work, because then they'll over time will then depreciate in the muscle mass. So then they'll have to continue maintaining it by continuing to go through that suffering experience. So then what I'm saying here is that what God will make sure that happens, let's say just take the hurricane example, is that hurricane will still provide an opportunity for the exercising of that virtue, such that you are then maintaining it, because there is still the possibility of not. So the person who is an exemplar has to maintain that status. They'll be more inclined towards being courageous, but they could, for whatever reason, decide not to be courageous, because it's still a logical possibility. So every time that the hurricane's coming, there is still the self-forming choice of, am I going to, for the 99th, 100th time, be courageous and save this individual? Or am I actually just going to give up and say, I can't do this anymore, I'm tired, I've done enough, someone else needs to do it? And so then that will then be depreciating them in their status. So there needs to always be the constant exercising of the virtue over time for the maintenance of it, and that's still included within the transformative process. The second thing as well is, I think the limitation in this hypothetical scenario is that God is just going to provide one type of suffering. So let's say it's just a hurricane, but I think God will have sort of the issue that you have in mind and say, no, there needs to be variety of sufferings that I'm going to give to these people. So God is not limited to just say, I'm just going to send the hurricane, because maybe it would just allow them to exercise courage situated in hurricane saving. But actually, courage situated in hurricane saving is very different from courage of defeating a ninja, okay, who's trying to rob a person, or trying to help someone who's going through this. So there are different ways in which courage needs to be expressed, and it's not just one monolithic virtue, but it's situated specifically in circumstances. Or patience, for example. I can show patience towards my daughters a lot easier than to a stranger. But so God is going to place me in scenarios where patience has to be exercised in various ways for it to be a true exemplarist virtue. Because an exemplar is someone who's going to be patient in all circumstances, is going to be courageous in all circumstances, or is going to be wise in all circumstances. So two things that I've said is God is going, the first one is that someone needs to maintain the status over time. So there'll always need to be the constant possibility of not maintaining or not having the virtue, or not exercising the virtue. And then the second one is God will want to give a variety of different suffering experiences to those islanders, such that they'll be able to acquire situation-specific virtues, or situation-specific expressions of those virtues.
So I want to say two things really fast, just on the first point. So the first one, with the Islanders, the thing that I just had it. The second thing that I thought, or the first thing that I thought of, is essentially maintenance dose suffering. You mentioned the person that goes to the gym that is a bodybuilder. Yeah. If we can, it's a bad connection to make, but if we consider being unexemplary or anti-exemplary as being out of shape, overweight, and the transformation is going to the gym and losing 50 pounds in a month, the kind of exercise that somebody needs to get fit from being overweight to in shape is much more than they need to just maintain their build. And so there's kind of a transformation dose of suffering and a maintenance dose of suffering. If it's the case that I went to the gym, but I only performed the maintenance dose, but I'm out of shape, it's either going to take me forever to get to where I need to be, or I'm never going to get there. And so we still have the issue of we have to have that transformation dose of suffering to get over the hill to where we can use the maintenance. But by the time we get past there, now there's all this suffering we needed to transform, but now we're stuck with it. We need the maintenance amount of suffering, but we're stuck with all this transformation amount of suffering. The other thing that I already forgot what it was. That was the first thing. Can
I address maybe that one, and then maybe you can think of, unless you have it.
No, I got to put this back to let someone else do it. But okay. If I can think of it, I'll chime back in.
Okay. Yeah. That was great. Can I just respond? You might not get the chance to respond back unless there's no one else. But I do agree with you. Maybe someone then, so sorry, this gym analogy, just because I'm a gym goer, so it's sort of fresh in my mind. But what I'll think in that sort of scenario is, yes, that's very true. Someone who's, let's say, just started lifting weights is going to need to, be, also, let's say losing weight, it's going to have to be, have a certain type of regime to lose the weight compared to the one that has already lost the weight and needs to maintain. But then when you get to a maintenance level, it actually is that the intensity needs to increase. So, for example, when you've lifted weights, you now no longer can lift, let's say, 50 kilograms of weight to build the muscle. You now need to lift 100 kilograms of weight. It needs to be even more challenging for you to be able to actually go further on in maintaining, but also growing whilst you're doing it. Because whilst you're growing, you are sort of maintaining as well what do you already have. So then the person who's going through, let's say, as an exemplar, might be the person who's even going to face more intense suffering than the person who had to go through the transformation. Or let's say the kind of courage that they'll need to show would be different, or different in its sort of in its depth of expression than the one of the person who is just going through the exemplar and training process. So what I'm still saying is that there'll still be, in God, who being omnipotent, he'll have obviously the ability to say, okay, this person's come through the threshold now, has become an exemplar. Now I want them to maintain this status so that they can be an exemplar within society. Now, in order for them to do that, they still need suffering to be able to exercise their courage, exercise all these things. Okay, but then there might need to be a different dose that will be necessary for this person to be able to have a different intensity rather than the other one. So I'm not seeing it as a problem such that a God who's omnipotent would be able to, and omniscient, know what will be needed to be able to allow that maintenance dose. It's only if you are assuming that God is going to use one level of suffering for that's applicable to everyone. But I don't believe that God will have to be sort of limited in that way. Yeah.
And I did remember my other one.
Yes. Yeah.
It's semi-related to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, we're coming up on 10 minutes left. I'll write it in an email and send it to you.
I'd love to, because these are great points. So thank you so much. I really appreciated it. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry. Howdy. I'm a
Hi, how you
backup,
doing?
so I can actually get in camera. I've been hiding from the laptop this whole time. Hello. Okay.
Hi. Good to see you.
Is it okay if we email you after this to ask more questions about the?
Of course. I'm very happy to field any questions. Yeah.
Awesome then. Cool. I'm going to save my question for the email then, because also I don't want to look like a fool. Anyone else?
Okay, so I think my question is pretty brief, and I hope you can word this correctly because I'm like only minorly like a philosophy buff. So it seems like what you're saying is like, so a maintenance dose at the gym, like you technically have to keep increasing that maintenance, so it's never the same maintenance. So would you say that the sort of ever evolving like consciousness that we seem to keep evolving to have sort of pertains to, if there's pain, that pain has to be a little bit more intense because we're more aware of the pain over time, and therefore that would be maybe a stronger maintenance, like increasing the weights, because as we go as humans, we get smarter. So the pain would be like an increased weight that you're like lifting to maintain the muscle.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think so, because it will no longer be suffering anymore if we always are going through the same thing. So in this lecture, I didn't actually define what suffering is. Again, this is where the plug's coming in, but I go through the definition there in the book. But suffering I take from a person called Michael Brady. So he wrote a book called Suffering and Virtue, and it's nothing to do with God. He's a non-theist, but he defines suffering as having two conditions. You have a sensation, so let's say a pain. It can be mental sensation or a physical one. And the second one is that you have an current desire for it not to occur. So basically what that means is that suffering is you have a sensation and you don't want that sensation to happen. Okay. Now, if I'm always getting the same pain all the time, I'm going to get used to that pain. I generally could probably get used to that pain such that my current desire might still be there, but there's also a question that it might not be there anymore. So, for example, if I put my hand in front of a hot sort of, fire because I want to warm my hands, I'm like, ouch, oh, that's really painful. I don't like that. But let's say I kept it there for quite a while and I keep on doing that. Over time, I'm probably going to get used to it such that I don't really mind to remove it anymore. So what God will need to make sure that he does is that in order for it actually to be suffering, it always has to be unpleasant. I don't want it. So in every scenario, it has to be that it could be that he has to up the pain level of whatever the person's going through so that it keeps being unwanted by that person. So they don't become used to it, so that it still is a suffering experience. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
No, thank you.
Do we have any more?
Yes, I have one question. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Excuse me, I'm not a philosophy major. I may be a little naive to the subject, but I'm curious about, does hell create a problem for the problem of evil? Simply because with the premise of the problem of evil, we have the concept of an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful God, of course. And of course, with that, we have the implication that it's not just some deity who's there to fulfill the purpose of ending infinite regress or whatever. It's a very specific God. And with that, probably comes the implication of a hell, considering this specific God, is obviously correlates to the Judeo-Christian God. So in hell, with the concept of indefinite suffering to no ends, something that can't really be grown from, would that create a problem for the problem of evil and its solution?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Thank you for that question. A very important question. Yes, it is a real issue. This was brought to light or highlighted by a person called Marilyn McCord Adams, and so she wrote, I think it's called "The Problem of Hell for Christians," or so, it must be something like that. So she basically reformulated the problem of evil, good God, all powerful and evil, and she changed it to hell, and was showing actually how it seems to be the case that this provides just as a substantial problem for belief in God, a belief in hell, than the general problem of evil that a lot of people try to deal with. So her solution was, well, the way that you need to go about this is just saying that God doesn't send people to hell. So universalism. Now, generally, most people don't want to take the position of universalism, just because. So, for my example, I'm a Christian. I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, so I hold to the importance of tradition. And within tradition, we've never taught that that universalism is is something that we are to believe as Christians. We can be hopeful universalists. That is, that we hope that God will bring everyone to Him. So it's a possibility, but we cannot ever teach it dogmatically that this is actually going to be the case. So theologically, for theological reasons, we cannot be universalists. That's what most Christians will say. However, this then still is a problem, because there is a philosophical problem here. So how do we deal with it? Most people would say, even universalists will say, that hell is something which is necessary for a belief in a just God. Because let's say we take the example of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler murdered himself or killed himself without ever paying for the things that he did. And so he killed millions upon millions of people, and nothing ever happened to him. Justice was never served. So there is sort of a retributive element that has gone unpaid for, which, if there wasn't a hell and everyone went to heaven, that would still be like, what's Adolf Hitler doing here? You'd be looking around saying, oh, great, Mother Teresa, all these people, Adolf Hitler, what is he doing here? Like, that would be a weird thing. So what people say, even universities will say, that there still needs to be a hell, but hell needs to serve a function, not of punishment, but of reformation. So retribution and reformation. So the way to think about this is like prison. So we send people to prison, not just to deter other people, but we try to do it for two reasons: of this person needs to pay for what they did, so they get 20 years because they did this horrible thing. But we also want them to be reformed within that specific scenario, so they never do it again. So what a lot of people hold to is something called a purgatorial hell. That hell serves a function of paying for the crimes that you did, but also reforming the individual, such that Adolf Hitler, he could potentially be released and go to heaven, but he'll have to pass through hell in order to pay for what he did and to be reformed in his character towards the goodness. And thus we can say Adolf Hitler is allowed in heaven, but he has to go through the punishment of hell before he gets there. Now, I myself, if you are interested, and you can email me further about this, I did publish on hell. It's called The Problem of Hell, and I give a certain model of how you can have hell in this way, but you don't necessarily need universalism. So I try and show that you can have a reformative hell, but it doesn't necessarily lead to you having universalism, because, as I said to you, most Christians or even Muslims and others won't want to hold to universalism because it hasn't been taught by either the Quran or clearly by church tradition. So yeah, you can email me further if you want to look at further readings on it. Yeah, but I would say, just very summary point, hell is a problem, and so people have conceptualized what hell is in order to deal with the problem.
Right, thank you. That added a lot of nuance to the situation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah.
Doctor, first,
Yes.
Tommy, can we get one?
oh no, I would just like to say thank you for your presentation. It was very wonderful. If you're out of time, that's fine.
No, please, if you have a question, please ask it. I can go longer, it's not a problem.
Sure.
Yeah.
I can keep it rather short as well. It's kind of in three parts, and it is a question. I don't want this to sound like a counter argument at all.
Yeah.
I'm curious, why is suffering logically necessary? Now, of course, there's Plantinga's free will defense, but could, or why couldn't God have created a world where free will does not require suffering? And if God couldn't, does that pose its own issue?
Okay, yeah, very good. Okay, so just from Plantinga's own point of view, so I don't hold to Plantinga's reasoning, but just from his own reasoning, he says that God couldn't create a world where there are libertarian free creatures and evil doesn't exist, because libertarian freedom, according to Plantinga, was that you have the ability to choose between alternatives, so you can choose X and Y, and so you have no compulsion in choosing X or Y. And so if God created those type of creatures but made them always do good, choose X and never choose Y, then they will not have that libertarian freedom, because they will have compulsion. So he says that then that's why God allows evil, or why evil exists, is because it's the result of people just misusing their freedom that he's given them. And then he says it's not a problem because God is defined as God is defined as a being, or his omnipotence is defined as the ability to bring about any logically possible state of affairs. And it's not logically possible to bring about libertarian free creatures and there not be any evil as a result of their actions, or the possibility of that. Now, I don't endorse this solution because I don't believe libertarian freedom is valuable enough for the amount of suffering that exists within the world. So my own idea is, my argument that I give, again, in longer form in the book, is I believe this whole idea of exemplar transformation, where we actually become exemplars and we allow the West of reality to become exemplars as well. So sorry, just not to take more time, but just to unpack this a little bit more. So I sort of give the picture that when God is creating the world, he decides that he wants to make humans be co-creators with him. So God creates the world ex nihilo, in the sense of he creates everything materially from and by himself. We don't do anything to bring about the world materially. But what God allows us to participate in is the creative activity of making the world axiologically in a certain way, making the world into a good world. So by the lives that we live, we determine how the world is actually like axiologically. And so we participate as co-creators with God in making the world into the type of world that it should be. And the way that we do that is through transforming into exemplars, that over time, by me responding to my suffering, by participating in the basic goods, exercising my self-formative abilities, acquiring virtues, and undergoing transformative experiences, I become an exemplar. And then the key thing, and I didn't bring this up in the speech, was the way that exemplarism spreads is through emulation. When I see someone who is an exemplar, I admire them and I want to be like them. So I then start undergoing the exemplar transformation process by me emulating that person's life. And then I become an exemplar, and then someone else admires me, and then they become exemplars. And then like a fire in a forest, it spreads around the whole world. So that's how the world can then become a good world, through this exemplarist formation. And I believe that's a very valuable good that God will want to bring about. And then my argument is, suffering at each of those stages, for me to participate in the basic goods, I need the contrast to be able to understand it and thus participate fully. For me to self-form, to exercise my self-forming abilities, there needs to be a tension between my motivations. Should I help or should I not help? For me to be able to acquire the virtues, there needs to be adversity for me to be courageous, and for me to be patient, and me to be compassionate. And then for me to undergo transformative experiences, I need suffering, because it provides the most intense experience possible. Think about it. If you have been stabbed in your chest, and let's say you're on your way to a party, and you are ready to eat some pizza, and you're really thinking about that pizza all this time, you're going to be thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I've been stabbed in my chest. But you're not going to say, I don't care, I'm just going to go and get my pizza and party all night long. No, when you're suffering, that takes all your attention away from everything. So God wants to use suffering as a way in which it's going to cause you to be wholly attentionally focused on becoming an exemplar. And then over time, you'll become this and then change the world. That's sort of my pitch that I give for this. Yeah.
We have one more.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, hello.
Yeah.
Just in regards to the concept of which you mentioned in your entirety of the speech you made, just relating to historical references that with the fall of humans, and on the basis that the first humans that God has ever created, they were at a level of human perfection in which for our own experiences that are transforming us in a way to get to that level that we were once again in the way that we were expressively made according to how God wanted us to be. Just with that, and for clarifying on that, like understanding that is with sin being the evil, the root of all evil, wouldn't that be a factor that plays in the overall experience in our life as to why that suffering actually exists, when in fact that there was no point for suffering to be conceptualized, as we were initially meant to be perfect humans according to the image and likeness of God.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for that. So what I would say is that there are sort of two things. The first thing is that I take the interpretation of Genesis 1 in the sense of we didn't start perfect. It's an assumption actually that came into theological thinking by a person called Saint Augustine, so Augustine of Hippo, so an influential theologian, where he interpreted the fall of Adam and Eve as a fall from perfection to imperfection. But actually prior to that, there were other theologians, specifically in the eastern part of the empire, a guy called Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, who was living in the 2nd century. And he interpreted the fall as a development. And this is brought up by a guy called John Hick, who was a famous philosopher who died a number of years ago, where he actually focused on this and tried to bring back this Irenaean thought that actually we weren't created perfect. We were created good. And that's the way that it sort of states it. God never says, and the world was perfect. We assume that when God said that the world was good, that, he meant that it was actually perfect, and then they fell from grace. But the problem that you have with that conceptually is, how can someone who's perfect actually become imperfect? Like, it just doesn't seem to be the possibility. If I'm perfect, my motivational structures will also be perfect as well, such I'll never desire to do anything wrong. So it doesn't make sense. It's like saying, could Satan tempt God to do wrong? It just doesn't make sense because he's perfect. And so if Adam and Eve were perfect, then they could never really have been tempted or give in to the temptation of the snake. So I think the best interpretation of Genesis is actually the idea of that humans were to become the image of God over time. They were to become the image and likeness of him through obedience to God. And so the first challenge that they faced was, are they going to believe God or not? Are they going to follow the Satan or not? And they decided to follow the Satan. And thus they went through a developmental course that was against God rather than for God. So yeah, I take the view of, I counter the assumption that humans were created perfect. Secondly, I also don't believe that evil necessarily came to the world with sin, because the problem that you'll have with that is sin came into existence with the first human wrongdoing. But there was evil that was happening to animals prior to that. So it depends, obviously, your view of Genesis. But if you take sort of a view that takes into account contemporary science, that animals predated human life, then we have billions upon billions upon billions of animals who have died and died horrific deaths because of the suffering that they've gone through without any human sort of input or influence. So I would say that if you just limit evil to be as a result of sin, then you can't really account for why there was predating animal suffering, predating the human existence. And then also, it doesn't make sense for why all animals who are never in contact with humans are also going to have evil happening to them. So, for example, you have something like a parasitic wasp, and what a parasitic wasp does is that it basically it stings a host, and it implants eggs into the host's body, and then the eggs eat up the host. Now, you might be thinking that, what is that to do with Adam deciding to eat a fruit? Like, how did that come about? So what I'm saying to you is there is various things that are not explained by the sin explanation. What you could say is that evil came into the human realm because of sin. But you can't say all evil came into the human realm, came into the animal kingdom because of sin. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There's a lot as to what you said that I would like to add on, but because of time, maybe all that communication could just be taken into email. But just in regards to this would be a lovely discussion for this association. If we could have that in a next future meetings, just of what this question actually is all about. So that would be a great, nice idea for a conversation. So
thank you.
Okay, that'll be all for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh yeah.
I got impatient. I don't want to know anymore. He's gonna get back in camera and be like, "Hi, in camera. Hi again." Okay.
Hi.
So I got impatient. I didn't want to email. I just wanted to ask.
Okay.
So I thought we were out of time. Okay. So here's essentially my question. So we know that suffering leads to exemplary transformation for both, like, either the people who suffer, or if they don't transform, it's the people around them. And from all suffering, God transforms exemplary because he experiences the suffering and can grow from it, right?
Yes, yeah.
So if our purpose is to strive to become exemplars, or have as many exemplars as possible to make the world a better place, and honestly, to make God as exemplary as possible, as good as possible through our suffering, well, what about, okay, so this is gonna sound crazy, but let's say one person decides to be like a sacrificial animal or something, and they decide to be as terrible as possible, the most awful person on the planet, and creates as much suffering, strife, and pain and hardship for everybody else as they can. So that way, everyone else has to become exemplary and grow, and God becomes exemplary and grows. And, you know, eventually they'll throw out this evil dictator or evil king or whatever, and the world will be good. So if we're all striving to be exemplary, shouldn't one person strive to be the worst person possible? The scapegoat almost. The scapegoat.
Yeah, no, I like that. That's a very good.
Anti-Jesus, yeah, or something. Sorry.
Yeah, that's a very good. I like that. So, I would say no, and the reason why is because an exemplar would be someone who also stops suffering. So, for example, why do we have doctors? We have doctors because they are trying to stop the suffering of people, and you have an exemplary doctor, someone who tries their best to, develop the best medicine or enact the best medical practice so that there's less suffering in the world. So if someone's an exemplar, they're going to try and reduce the amount of suffering. So they wouldn't want someone who's going to proliferate suffering around the world so that other things can come about. So what we would say is that, if you're an exemplar, you'll want to limit the amount of suffering. So you're going to want to stop that person from doing that, firstly. And then secondly, that person as well, their focus I would want that person to become an exemplar. So it's not good for me to call, let's say, for example, that so I've got 3 kids. Let's say one of my kids needs to grow morally. So I'm gonna say to my other kid, oh yeah, I'm gonna cause you to be the worst kid ever. You're gonna be really bad. You're gonna be doing so much. I'm gonna give you alcohol and blah blah blah, so you can start doing really bad. So your other child who I'm filming, I can see how they're gonna respond and hopefully teach you to do the right thing. Now, anyone would say that's a horrific parent. You should never do that. You should allow both of them to be able to be exemplars, to be the best children possible, and not use one as that scapegoat. So it will be wrong then for exemplars within that community to ever enable another one not to themselves become an exemplar, but to become someone who is proliferating this value. So the 2 things I was saying is, firstly, exemplars will want to limit the amount of suffering that's in the world. So they wouldn't want this person to bring around suffering just for that cause. And then secondly, they will want also to influence that person to become an exemplar themselves, because that would be a good that they'll want to bring about.
One more thing, if I'm allowed, is that the person who's doing all this evil stuff, they are not an exemplar. They want more people to be exemplars, but they themselves do not want to be an exemplar. Because, I totally agree. If they are an exemplar themselves, it would not make sense if they want to start suffering. However, if they're like totally fine with awful stuff, but they want God to be as good as possible and everyone else to be good as possible. If the parent is a terrible parent, but he has a billion children, so he's going to make them all selfish so they can all be a billion exemplars. I mean, a billion is more than one, right?
Is this
Yeah,
like a extremely utilitarianism?
I don't know. Because that sounds like that, yeah.
Yeah, that was sort of my response. I think the calculus would not be great here, because we'll want to have the intrinsic value upheld of every person, irrespective of the consequence of the mass that are sort of benefited by it. So, for example, if I have 10 kids and I allow one of my kids, so 10, you know, for a lot of people, 10 is a lot of kids. So if I have 10 kids, that's more than enough. And probably I should stop. So I've got 10 kids. It seems bad that I allow one of them to just become a really bad kid, like drinking, starting drugs really young, all those sort of things. Like, it just seems like it doesn't matter, even if, let's say, I was to allow them to do that so that the 9 can huddle around and raise that person in the right way. We would think that would still not be good. And I'll probably have all my kids taken away from me just because I've done bad to that one. So it seems like God will value just the single individual over that of benefiting the masses, God would say to himself that I can bring about the exemplarist sort of transformation of everyone without this scapegoating process. It's only if God was limited to the scapegoating process that he might say, aha, maybe this is what I need to do. But God could say, no, I could send natural disasters, I could send cancers, I could send all these things that are going to require virtuous responses. Thus, the exemplarist process will happen, rather than me having to just be limited to this one scapegoat. So I think God wouldn't have to be limited to do that type of transformative means. Hi, so sorry, I can't actually hear you. I don't know if the mic's on or.
There's another one.
Here, this one's green.
Okay, yeah.
But use the green one. Don't press the button. I made that mistake before. Don't press the button.
And just so everyone knows, we have the room in silver. Yes.
Dr. Sijuwade?
Yeah. Hi.
Hey, thanks again for this talk. So I'm faculty here at UTSA. Just two quick questions. One is a follow-up to what Dave was asking. You mentioned that God wouldn't scapegoat people, but then that seems to maybe push against earlier the concern about how people like severe cognitive impairments fit in to the world, because it seems like they are a kind of scapegoat, because it seems like they can't develop themselves. So it seems like at some level it would be okay to scapegoat. But then it's like, if we're using the kid example, like seems like it'd be really bad if you cause severe brain damage to a child, knowing that it would cause the siblings to grow and moral character. If you had thoughts about that. And then just another thing unrelated, at the beginning when you mentioned how Zexepsi's view about how God experiences all of our experiences first personally, and God exemplifies virtue insofar as he experiences the positive things or certain things. Could it also be God would exemplify vice by experiencing the negative things? So thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. So I think, it's good for me to qualify. Maybe there is an element of scapegoatism, but I think maybe the one that I reject is the instance of scapegoatism that was being put forward, that there is sort of this one individual who all people are reliant upon, and all evil is being put on that one person, so that then the mass can then be transformed. I think God wouldn't use that, because I just think that won't be fair, specifically on that one individual. So there is a certain element in which God does use people for the benefit of others. And we do that. I mean, a lot of the time we do use certain individuals for the benefit of others. So think about, not to bring up controversial things, but we send people to war, and the country's using those people for the benefit of others, the greater good of, the peace and of the civilization. So we do use people, and we see it as being good in certain circumstances. So God necessarily using some people who cannot transform for the benefit of others is not necessarily a bad thing if we do call them scapegoats. I do think it's just that instance was a bad one that God wouldn't use. I do, however, again, I didn't bring up in the talk, but in other work I have, and in the book, I speak about God compensating these individuals. So specifically what I talk about are there are certain connections that are formed through suffering. So I draw on a work of a guy called Robin Collins, who brought in sort of this idea of ACI connections. So connections of appreciation, contribution, and intimacy. And so when you go through suffering with someone, you normally appreciate let's say that you benefit off the suffering of someone. So someone suffers for you, you normally appreciate them. So there's a connection of appreciation that's been born between you two. You also see them as someone who's contributed to your well-being. So there's there's further like debt that you feel owed to them, that you want, that you have in this relationship. And you also have an element of intimacy. So, for example, and let's say that you're on a plane and, the plane is fine. You've got, in most examples of plane rides, you don't probably speak to the people next to you. You want to sleep and you want to watch the movie. But let's say the plane now just starts to nosedive to the ground. Everyone is screaming. You're probably now going to see that person next to you as someone that you want to interact with. You're saying, "Are you okay? This," and you're both trying to console each other. And let's say then the plane, over time, then is able to land, and everyone doesn't die. Think about now how the relationship is probably different between you and the passenger next to you than it was without that suffering experience that you went through. It's because you went through that suffering together that you have this connection of intimacy that wouldn't be there without that having gone through those two things together. So now my key thing is, because God omni-subjectively experiences all suffering of all cognitive agents, there are ACI connections that are born between those people and God. And these are connections of appreciation. God actually is going to appreciate you, and you're going to understand the appreciation that the greatest source of goodness has for you. You also have contributed to the well-being of others, and God is going to make that known to you. And also there'll be a depth of intimacy that God, who has shared that suffering with you, that you're going to have that you wouldn't have had outside of that suffering experience. And so the idea that I have is every non-exemplary sufferer is going to be taken to heaven to be in a beatific relationship with God, and they will then have these ACI connections that is going to be at the basis of their relationship. Now, this doesn't lead to universalism, because non-exemplary sufferers are those who are not cognitively able. The majority of them. So no one who's a Christian is going to say that someone who is mentally disabled is going to be sent to hell. No, because they never had the opportunity to respond to Christianity. So anyone who's a non-exemplary sufferer is going to go to heaven, but they're going to go to heaven with a depth of relationship with God that is going to be deeper than if they didn't have that suffering experience, because of those suffering experiences. So that's a compensatory thing. They're going to have a depth of relationship with an incommensurate good, which is God in heaven. And then, sorry, just the second one with omni-subjectivity. The key thing here that Sijuwade speaks about is when God is omni-subjective and he sees things from a first-person perspective, he still retains his good. He still retains his nature. So when God is empathetic with those who are suffering, he's going to express the virtues that are in line with his nature. He's not going to express anything that's out of line with his nature. So if, the person is showing courage, God is going to show courage with that person. But if the person is showing anger in their suffering, God is not going to, because anger is not, or anger in that specific way is not something that corresponds to the nature that he has. So he's only going to show things that are corresponding to his nature, which will be the virtues and not the vices.
Thanks, that's really helpful.
Oh, can you hear me? Hi.
Yes, I can. Yes, hi.
Okay, perfect. Hi. I don't know if anyone else addressed this, but on like I guess, the idea of like counterproductive suffering, like suffering that causes like pain and or like things that don't necessarily exemplify God. Would you say that those don't lead to being an exemplary kind of sufferer, or is that just like part of like, is that just like kind of thrown out with the bathwater? I don't know a better way to phrase that.
Yeah. Would you, sorry,
Not not unnecessary, but suffering that only I guess shows up in negative traits. Like suffering that only leads to bitterness, resentment, et cetera, et cetera. Is that not necessarily? I mean, it doesn't lead to transformation at all. That's the question? Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you guys? Does that?
Yeah, no. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I understand what you're saying. What I would say, however, is for any case of suffering, there is always the possibility of those two things happening. So what I'm saying is that it's never the case that someone undergoes a suffering and it's always going to have as the one possible response negativity. I think that because of the capabilities that we have, God is going to either always keep the option open that the person is going to respond in a virtuous manner towards the suffering over the non-virtuous one, or even if that they don't, their suffering still provides the grounds for others to do that. So even if the person himself is so inclined towards just hate that they're just going to always respond negatively, that doesn't necessarily mean that the people are going to do that. And this, interestingly, this also, I've extended this to animals. So I know we always think, oh, animals are just, these ghosts in the sort of the Cartesian view, that they're just sort of these soulless beings. But actually, animals respond very much so to negative scenarios in positive ways. So, and whatever you point to, I'm always going to say that actually there is either the possibility for that person to choose the positive over the negative, or let's say that there isn't, there would be other individuals that can, either the other humans, the other animals, or God himself. That will always be the possibility there. So then that's why I'm trying to say this is comprehensive, because every instance of evil is either going to fall into those sort of two camps.
Okay. So you would say that like it's not like a chicken or the egg kind of thing. These two things like exist at the same time. Like kind of, it's not like, oh, one thing happens and then it's like contributed to what contributes to the transformation. It just, both these things are like happening at the same time. Right.
Can you just unpack that a little bit more? Sorry, just so. Yeah.
So, like, if so, let's say you are, when you feel like a positive or like virtuous feeling in response to suffering, would you say that that is, I guess, more personal than it has to do with God? Because that would be at least my view necessarily. But I want to see what you think is like. I'm asked. Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just trying to follow the issue. So it's when you mean personal. Sorry if I'm just asking clarification. I just want to answer Wealthy. So when you mean personal, what are you meaning by that? Sorry, just so.
I at least I'm taking from the idea that responses that you give to suffering come from usually internalized or like I want to say like a nature and nurture kind of combination. Would you say that that is because of God, or those things happen at the same time, or like what? Because I just want to see how God contributes the exact transformational part, at least, but I don't know if it's like actually a contribution, or these things just all happen at once, if that's makes more sense.
Yeah. So God is the one who in sort of indirect ways, God contributes. So he contributes by creating us with the capabilities to become exemplars. And so the cognitive abilities, because not everyone has, so there are lower animals that don't have the cognitive abilities to become exemplars. But God gives us that capability. So he is responsible for us ultimately becoming exemplars. Secondly, he creates the natural conditions such that the laws are in such a way that we can respond in a deliberative manner deliberate manner towards certain suffering experiences in a virtuous way. So the ways in which God has ordered the world is such that if I'm going through a suffering experience, there's always going to be this possibility to be virtuous over that of exemplifying of vice. Thirdly, God also places us providentially in the circumstances that we're in. So I have quite a strong view of divine providence. I believe that God places us in all scenarios that we're in. And so he places us in those scenarios so that we can then respond in a way that then furthers the exemplarist sort of transformation. So even the horrific scenario that I might be in, it's going to be there for either myself to become an exemplar or to provide others with those opportunities to do that through the suffering that I'm going through. Yet I will be compensated if I fulfill that second role. So I don't know at all if I've answered your question.
No,
but,
that's perfect. That
yes,
was literally the exact answer I was looking for. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Time? I don't know. 2:30. Oh no, we have the room till 3. Really? Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know who's next, but someone else can be next.
I'll roll it in.
Oh, okay. I'll pass it down.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Just a real pulse check, but how do you feel about being cracked open by like 12 different philosophers? You still have the time,
I enjoy it. No, it's very good. Yeah, I have no issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I just wanted to be respectful of your time is all.
Yeah, no worries. I'm happy to speak about this stuff and to help answer questions. So it's not a problem.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
So this is more so asking about your thoughts on specific examples. We're back to the animals, by the way. So in terms of the Gobi War and in more recent news, Punch, how would you view the moral actions of animals in these scenarios?
Sorry, can you unpack what those are? Sorry,
So the Gobi War, during a survey Jane Goodall was doing on chimpanzee ranges in West Africa, there was essentially a fracturing of a range where a separate group of chimpanzees formed their own range and had killed some women and children of the other range, and a war broke out essentially, where the original range then had to go in and take out the defector range. Punch is a sort of celebrity capuchin monkey who had been abandoned by his mother and had been bullied by the rest of the capuchins in captivity, and the zookeepers had given him a plushie of his mom to keep it. Yeah. So I just wonder your thoughts on those.
That's really sad. But no, thank you for that. Okay, so with the process of these animals becoming exemplars, it becomes a little bit more specific for animals. So I draw on the work of certain animal ethicists who have done, there's a very good book, so if anyone wants to look at this further, it's called Wild Justice. And you have these two philosophers and cognitive ethologists who look at various array of data, and they say that there are three sort of, I spoke about it in the speech, there are three types of categories that animals fall in: cooperation, empathy, and justice. So there are sort of three traits, clear traits that animals show relative to morality. So for them, one is altruistic cooperation. The second one is empathy, but that can also include virtues like compassion. And the third one is justice, that they establish within their social order certain structures of fairness, such that they punish those who are not acting according to the social norms. Now, within those scenarios, I would say then that those provide opportunities for maybe all of those three, or at least two of those three. So it allows there to be cooperation between those within the scenario. It allows them to, for those who maybe are suffering from the war, to actually show compassion and empathy towards the other animals that went through it. And it also allows a certain structure of justice to be established. So let's say after, through the fighting that they've gone through, they've then established a certain social structure based upon that. Now, I think that third one is a little bit weaker than the other two, but the key point here is that it still provides opportunities for these three virtuous traits to be acquired by a wide range of those participants in that sort of warlike structure. Now, in our scenario, this just doing cooperation, empathy, and fairness is not enough for people to go to war. Okay, because that's why I'm saying this is species specific. So for animals, we can't judge animals by the same sort of moral expression of virtue in the same way that we do. So in the way that we sort of express our virtues, cooperation and empathy and fairness are probably not enough for the things that are going to lead to wars and those sort of things. So that wouldn't be sufficient. And that's why for the transformations for exemplars, it's going to look different for humans than it is to animals. But cooperation is very important within the animal structure. Altruism is very, very important. And it also furthers, through various data, it furthers the evolutionary process. Having opportunities to be cooperative in, let's say, things like fighting, things like caring for others, and showing compassion are important. So that provides those opportunities for them to become exemplars relative to those clusters of cooperation, fairness, and empathy. With that other one, which is really sad about the bullying, I mean, that specific example, though, the monkeys sort of the animals suffering has had obviously, because they're in contact with humans, is going to have a wider effect of allowing other humans to become exemplars. So where that will be more challenging would be in a scenario where humans aren't around. So then you don't have that. But then someone could say, but then all beknown to us, there were other animals that actually were fighting off the bullies, and so they were trying to be compassionate towards the monkey that was suffering. So in that specific scenario, maybe that animal didn't transform into an exemplar, even though it might have been patient through its suffering, but it did provide others who were the humans in contact with it with a great amount of empathy towards it, that they try to fight off that type of suffering happening. Because when I think of that, when I just heard that, I was feeling really sad, and I want to go and get a pet monkey now or something, because you feel really bad about it, but it is having sort of an impact on others. Yeah.
So, yeah, I'll just start this. Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
I'm on board with the idea of exemplars, and I would agree that, like, for exemplars to exist, there must be like a foundation or framework that allows them to like come about. Yeah. And that might require certain bad things or knowledge of bad things. But my question is, could it be possible, or could God have made it possible for, instead of a real deer dying in a real forest fire, instead we read the fictional story about Bambi? Or instead of Hitler existing in the real and actual world, could not we have just looked towards like Emperor Palpatine or Sauron or something, and gain these important moral lessons, but without the physical real world suffering involved?
Yeah, very good point. And this is actually brought up in Zagzebski's work. So I developed this theodicy. It's called the Exemplarist Theodicy, but it's actually borrowing the moral framework, not actual the theodicy, but the moral framework from Zagzebski herself. So she wrote something called Exemplarist Moral Theory. She says that, and I agree with her, that you can have the exemplarist process being influenced by reading, by fictional sort of things. So for example, I believe that Jesus was, a true human being, historical figure who did all the things that he did. But let's say he wasn't, he would still be on the page of that book, an exemplar that we'll want to look to, and that will influence us. So yeah, definitely fictional beings can be. However, my counter would be, what is more effective in bringing about emulation? Fictional suffering or real suffering? So, for example, when we hear about Hitler, that Hitler did all these things, that gets an anger inside of us that we say we will never allow this to happen again. But when I read about, when I watch Emperor Palpatine, I'm like clenching my fist saying, "Oh, this is a horrible man." When I turn off the TV, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't change it. Yeah, maybe it's a horrible man, but it doesn't enact that sort of reality of saying, actually, there were people who died and went through this sort of thing. We cannot never allow this to happen again. We need to fight against this. And so I would say that the reality of the suffering brings about something more of a motivation to bring about the change in the world that we want. But then secondly, we also admire those who have actually gone through suffering more than we admire those who are just fictional. So, for example, I might admire, someone on the fictional text say, "Oh, this person's amazing." But I think the admirability of the individual, if they were actually living in the world, going through these things, is going to be greater in its intensity. And in order for the exemplarist process to work, we have to admire those people and then we emulate them. And so God wants the widest range of people to become exemplars. And so the widest range of people will become exemplars by us having the best type of exemplars possible. And those will be ones who we admire to the highest level. And that will be the real individual. So, I just think that's why, for example, Jesus actually living is important more so than Jesus just being in the text. Yes, he's great in the text, but did he actually do those things? That's why we care more about the historical question, more so than him dying on, say, for example, sorry, just last thing, him dying on the cross, that actually having occurred and that being a real thing will impact someone a lot more than reading about Jesus. So yeah, there's this guy who just, died on the cross in this book. Oh, that's really bad. But it seems like it's going to be a lot different than actually knowing that there was this person who was innocent and was killed in this type of way. So I think, the key things I was saying is it increases your motivation to change. And it also increases the admirability of the person, given that they are realized rather than them being fictional.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Question about omni-subjectivity. Does it extend to middle knowledge? So if someone has two choices available to them, but they pick option A, does God experience only option A, or does God experience what would have been as well?
That's very good. So I don't speak about this at all. I think it's Zagzebski she had a book that she released in 2023. I think she said it does extend to counterfactual knowledge, but don't quote me on that. I affirm middle knowledge. So I might have to think more about this if it actually does and what the implications are because I do affirm middle knowledge and I would like to know if actually that is the case. But just thinking through this on the spot, well, omni-subjectivity is the first person perspective of a cognitive agent. But there are no cognitive agents prior to the actualization of the world that occurs after God surveys logically his middle knowledge. Those things don't really exist. That's why you have the grounding objection, because they're not really there. So do they really have a first person perspective? That's an open question, but I'm then sort of countering in my mind. I think Zagzebski says all possible beings. So it could be that she leaves it open to actually, there are possible beings that haven't been actualized, and God still takes the first person perspective of those possible beings. So I think I've got to punt that one because I need to think more about it. I need to think more and what the implications. But did you see an implication of that, a problem that could be for the theodicy, or
just possibly, just because? So, do you know about David Lewis's pluriverse, where all possible worlds are conquered? So, if it is the case that God's middle knowledge or God's omni-subjectivity extends to middle knowledge, that means that if we assume like S5, which a lot of people do, so assuming S5, that means that God experiences, and will experience all the bad and all the good, actual and counterfactual. Well, and especially if you take Lewis's pluriverse approach, it's all actual. But if God's omni-subjectivity extends even to non-actual worlds, just to abstract worlds, you kind of have the issue of, even if I am a person in actuality and I go through some kind of suffering in one world, or I don't go through the suffering in another world, God experiences both all the same. And so the issue here is with David Lewis, you kind of get led down to moral nihilism, where it doesn't matter what you choose to do because there's another you in some other possible world that has actualized it. And so it kind of feels like every transformation that will occur, God has already experienced and undergone that transformation because of that middle knowledge. Yeah. So that's I don't know if that follows all the way through. It might, but it's I feel like omni-subjectivity follows kind of trivially from omniscience, because I also think that God doesn't just have like a detached omniscience. I think that God would experience the world pretty directly, like almost direct realism for God, because he's not subject to the same epistemic limitations that we are. So I would expect that to follow kind of trivially from it.
But no, that's really good. Yeah, that's really good. I really appreciate that, and I'll definitely think more about the sort of implications modally for this. And then I do agree with you completely. With Sijuwade, actually, that's one of her core arguments, that she believed that omni-subjectivity is entailed by omniscience. That's how she firstly sort of brought it into the field. So yeah, she'll say if God is cognitively perfect, there can't be a area of reality that he lacks, and that is our first person knowledge of things. Because if he just has third person knowledge, that's very different from knowing how the person was actually experiencing that event from a first person viewpoint. So yeah, she says that if he's omniscient and cognitively perfect, then it follows from that. Yeah, but yeah, I'll definitely I need to think more about the middle knowledge one, because that'll be interesting to see how that sort of plays out. Thank you.
That's it, you guys. Good. Yeah.
Oh. Well, I'm annoying. I want to ask. Hi, it's me again.
Yeah.
That guy. Okay. So, all right. I think this might be a utilitarian thing, and if it is, I apologize. So, there's no amount of suffering which has like a negative effect, because at minimum, if one person dies or if one person suffers, at minimum, even if that person doesn't transform into an exemplar, God does, right? Or God uses that to get better. So at minimum, it's one, or it's either one or that person transforms or more people transform. So God plus however many, right? Those are the two consequences of one person suffering.
Yeah.
So when a lot of people suffer, it's actually more people than that who are improved mathematically, right?
Yeah.
So when you have these evil dictators like Hitler is transforming more people than he killed.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, that's a good point. So in one perspective, I mean, yes, you have to say, because of what Hitler did, if this exemplarist framework is correct, then there were a vast, maybe millions upon millions of people who have responded to this, to the sort of Nazi regime and the evil that they did in virtuous ways. They've gone out and campaigned, and they helped those in need, and they've tried to overcome racism and prejudice. So yeah, there'll be many people that have transformed off of his evil action. So in that perspective, yes, but that still doesn't negate the intrinsic badness of what he did. So it's still an intrinsically bad thing that what he did, but then the result was a consequence of something which was unbeknown to him a good thing. And he wasn't aiming for it to be a good thing, but.
So when something is intrinsically bad, it's still like a bad thing to do, even if it makes people better, right?
No, so that's where the greater good sort of criteria comes in. So it has to be necessary to bring about the good, and it has to be, the value of the good has to be better than the badness of the action, the value of the good that comes about. So I'll give an example. If you see me cutting off the leg of someone in a forest, you're going to say, oh my gosh, that's such an evil person. Why are you doing that? And you'll try and fight me off. But then let's say I say to you, no, 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 and I bring out my badge and I say, I'm a doctor, I'm amputating his leg. He's going to die if I don't do this. Now, even though the action of cutting off the leg is a bad thing, in the second scenario, because you understand there's a production of a greater good, the saving of the life over the disvalue of not having a leg, that seems to be something which you'll still bring about. So even though it's intrinsically bad to cut off legs, it's always bad, because the good that can come about is something which outweighs the bad in some way. That's why it's something that's permissible to do. But let's say I said to you, oh no, I'm cutting off his leg because he doesn't like having hairy legs. Now, you say to me, yeah, okay, maybe having hairy legs is not a good thing. So it's a good that's coming about, that he has no longer hairy legs. But the disvalue of cutting off your legs is greater than the good that is produced by that, if you understand what I mean. So yeah, it's only if it produces a greater good with those two conditions being met, then it is something which can be actualized by a good being.
Okay, but even with the cutting off the leg, the value, again, because God is getting better with the suffering, there can be moments where the bad still outweighs the good. And in those moments where the bad outweighs the good, well, so God is exemplar, and exemplars want to stop suffering, right? When they can, unless it's necessary to do better, like working out.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when there's something like that happening, but the bad does outweigh the good, like, gosh, I want to say like a child's born with cancer. In that situation, I feel like the bad outweighs the good, because like, sure, the parents might appreciate life more, but a child died, right?
Yeah. So I mean, this is that's the problem of that second condition. It seems to be a little perspective, because someone might say, well, I believe this good is it has a greater value than someone else with a different perspective will say no. And so that's why you can't really quantify these. But I personally take the position that contributing to the life of God, and specifically the intrinsic life of God, is always going to outweigh anything that I go through. If I'm actually doing something for God, but not doing something that doesn't, I'm just, building a bridge for him. I'm actually bettering God in a certain way, which sounds really weird, but in some way I'm making God improve in the life that he has, the incommensurate good. For me, I just feel, maybe that's from my own perspective, I feel that that's always going to be a valuable act. That when I get to heaven, I know that I contributed to the life of God, and the connection I'll have with him, that ACI connection, because of that, seems to be something that I don't know. I wouldn't want to say, okay, you know what, I want to take out, the suffering so that I didn't actually participate in that way. So yeah, I understand the humans transforming might always feel like, really? But I feel like, I don't know, just from my own sense, God is an incommensurate good. And so if I'm participating in the life of God in a certain way, in such a deep manner, then I feel like that's going to always be such a valuable action that I can't see my disvalue being. Oh yeah, and sorry, something I didn't mention as well. The ACI connections, those appreciation, contribution, and intimacy connections that are formed in suffering, according to Collins, and what I assume in the model as well, in the Theodicy, is that they increase in value over time. So you can think about it that the relationship that I have with that friend, the more I spend with them, that person that I had the plane scenario with, the more time I spend with them after that, the formation of our friendship, probably the deeper the connections are going to be, the more valuable my relationship is. Like, think about it. If you lose a friend that that's been around you for 2 months, you're probably not going to care that much. If you lose a friend that's been around you for 10 years, that's really going to impact you a lot more. So the idea here is that the relationship you're going to have with God is going to always increase in depth and value over time, that connections you have with God. So you're going to, God, that appreciation he has for you, the contribution you had towards him becoming an exemplar, and the intimacy you have with God, whilst you're with him in heaven, it's going to always increase in value. That your relationship is going to be so much so that, oh yeah, that smidgen, I know it sounds so horrible, but just from that perspective of that little temporal slice of the suffering you went through is not going to over time outweigh the near infinite value of that relationship you have with God. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. See that. So, but with that, what is intrinsically bad then? If all of the bad is outweighed by the good with God, what is bad?
Yeah. So when I say intrinsically bad, I'm saying the action in and of itself, if it was viewed non-relationally, so it was viewed without the consequences being taken into account, this would be seen as a bad thing. So that's why I said with the cutting the leg scenario, if you just take cutting the leg of anyone, that's just taken as a bad scenario. When you put in consequences, then it becomes a scenario where the value is going to be changed because there's extrinsic value given to it. So the idea here is that the consequence, the result, is something that's made the action, even though it's intrinsically bad, be permissible to be brought about. So it still has the same intrinsically bad value, but the extrinsic value that's given to it by the consequence that it brings about is allowing it to be a morally permissible thing. And so that's why then it's brought about. So it still stays bad. And if I was to remember let's say the suffering I went through when I'm in heaven and I remember the suffering, I'll be like, yeah, that was not a good thing. I still feel, that wasn't a nice thing. But then the result that came about ultimately is something that the extrinsic value is so great that it's morally permissible for God to then bring about.
See, okay, yeah. That makes sense. But oh yeah, 5 minutes. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi again. My question is just it may be a little bit of a question of hypocrisy, but the question is just how was it possible for Jesus to go through transformation when the conditions of suffering didn't apply to him as he was God himself? And then to follow after that question, would it also mean that God positioned himself to be a human self to undergo transformation just to be able to relate to humanity's defection from their morality, only have based on goodness and, purity?
Yeah, thank you. That's great questions. So the first one, I would say because the traditional position on Jesus's nature is that he had two natures. He had a complete divine nature and he had a complete human nature, yet he was a single person. And so the way in which that he was able to undergo suffering was through the exercising of the capabilities within his human nature. And so because he took on a human body, because he had a human mind, he was able to have mental suffering happening to him. When he was carrying the cross, you can imagine he was exhausted. And then also physical suffering. When the nails went into his hands and his feet, he was going through pain. So because he had a complete human nature. So it's only if that Jesus had just a divine nature, then he wouldn't be able to go through that direct suffering that he went through. And then with the second one, I don't believe that's the case. Well, I didn't go through it as well, and I don't go through it in this book. But if anyone's interested, I have sorry, I've got so many writings, but I have a paper that I wrote where my response is going to be is spelled out a little bit more. But basically, the idea here is that when I'm talking about God, I'm talking about the Father. So the Father is the one who, let's just say you leave the other two persons of the Trinity to the side for a second. You have the Father, and he is the one who's being omni-subjective with all of humanity. So he's undergoing, from a first-person perspective, all of the cognitive states that we're going through the suffering. So it's God in that state. He's going through that through his omni-subjectivity. Yeah, a key thing that I said is that the reason why God does this is to be the ontological ground of morality and to be the epistemic ground. The ontological ground is that God is by him being courageous, being patient, being compassionate, he in this sort of omni-subjective way, he is providing the ultimate perfect instance of those things. So he is the perfect instance of courage, of this and that. But then the second thing, and this is the key point, is that in order for God to be the epistemic ground as a supreme exemplar, he needs to become incarnate so that we can know what the epistemic standard is for the good life. So if the Father didn't send Jesus, then we wouldn't have knowledge of this epistemic standard that God is. Because God is the supreme exemplar, if he didn't become a human and live like us, then we wouldn't know what compassion is like as a human, what courage is like as a human, what perfect patience is like as a human. So we'll need to know things relativized to the human species, and so the Son had to become incarnate in order to express this exemplarity in a human-like way so that we can follow it. So sorry, that was a bit of a long explanation, but my key point for this one was that the incarnation is not for relatability, but it's in fully for relatability. There's various reasons why, for sin, for other reasons, but one reason would be that God also wants to provide the ultimate standard for what his supreme exemplarity is in a human context. And think about the Bible, that seems to be the way in which it is. Paul says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. And we look to Christ also as the one who lived the perfect human life. So it seems like Christ was the perfect exemplar. So he is the perfect exemplar in a human form. So that's one of the reasons why God will become incarnate in that way. Yeah. Sorry, that was a quite long response.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sijuwade. Please don't forget to send me that honorarium request in the form that I send you over Messenger. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I didn't see that.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. I just want just my appreciation to everyone. Thank you for your great questions. You kept me on the hot seat for this, so I really had to think deeply. So thank you for this. I really appreciate it. And I hope you have a blessed rest of the day. Thank you, guys.
You made it to the end of this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider becoming a Patreon member for Apollos Christian Apologetics. Your partnership helps with creating original Christian apologetics research, gets you exclusive access to videos, and more. Want to catch me personally online? Well, feel free to join our Discord server. But in any case, Christianity is true, apologetics is base. This is your boy Apollo signing out. Peace.